topic near and dear to my heart, and of course I would like to also thank the city of Santarem for hosting this important conference. My name is Kruk. I will be speaking in English. I apologize for that. I hope that there might have been a translator, a simultaneous translation, but we'll have to do the best with what we have. And I'll try to speak slowly, and I hope that you'll get the gist of what I'm trying to get across. I wanted just to say a few words about myself. I come from a social science background. My profession is social work. I've been in the field many years and have practiced as a child and family social worker, and I'm now a professor of social work at the University of British Columbia. I've worked in many fields, including child protection, school social work, family services. I've worked in the children's hospital, but currently I'm doing, the little bit of practice that I do is in the field of family mediation and also the field of addictions a little bit. I teach mainly masters in social work students, and the courses all relate to child and family social work, and also family mediation and conflict resolution is an area of interest to me, and social work practice in the field of addiction. And I've been involved mainly in research that has examined the perspective of some of the more vulnerable family members that are experiencing hardships in the divorce transition. That includes divorced fathers. I've done 2 studies of divorced fathers. The first study really looking at the experiences of divorced fathers cross-nationally. I interviewed fathers in both United Kingdom and in Canada, and I compared the experiences of fathers who were non-resident fathers who were still in contact with their children, and with an equal number of fathers who had completely lost contact. That was back in the 1980s, and challenged this myth of the deadbeat dad. I found that quite the opposite. Fathers were suffering quite a severe grief reaction related to the loss of their children and their parental identity. And my conclusion was that it's a combination of psychological and structural factors that contribute to fathers' disengagement from their children. I've also looked at the experiences of grandparents that are affected by divorce, and as they're another very high-risk group that suffer a great deal, the loss of their grandchildren in their lives. I've looked also at the perspectives of children through the eyes of both parents. I've also done research on the experiences of divorced mothers, particularly those who are non-residential mothers, and their experiences I found are not that different from fathers who don't have custody. I've looked at the working methods of family mediators. I've used a survey method to look at what the practice of family mediators actually looks like. And I've also pioneered a simulated client design where myself and a group of researchers presented ourselves as divorcing clients to mediators, and then they facilitated a mediation process as they would with real clients. These were simulated clients, and then did a discourse analysis of that work. Yeah, and a few other projects related to the field of addictions as well. But my 2 fields of practice in social work right now include, first of all, our child and family policy and practice, and that includes the determination of parenting after divorce arrangements in situations of parental conflict, number 1. Different approaches to child custody, in other words. And secondly, looking at family mediation and conflict resolution applied to parenting after divorce, and what works and what doesn't work. The other field of practice for me and interest in teaching is addictions and illegal drug policy. And I just want to note that Portugal is quite famous in Canada, considered to be a leader in the field of more enlightened drug policy. In fact, many people are saying we should adopt the model in Portugal as our model in Canada in the addictions field, which is very much based on kind of a harm reduction philosophy, a more pragmatic kind of approach, moving away from criminalization to more of a regulation approach of illicit drugs. And I'd really like to see Portugal go in that more progressive and enlightened direction in the arena of parenting after divorce as well. So today I'd like to propose a framework of shared parenting that can be applied to the Portuguese socio-legal system. And I'll be talking about the idea of the best interest of the child from the perspective of the child, as opposed to a discretionary, judge-based kind of viewpoint of what is best for children. So a child-focused perspective. And secondly, I'll be talking more about a responsibility-based approach, parental responsibility to children's needs based approach, as opposed to a the kind of dominant rights-based system that we have today. So some of what I'm going to be saying to you will probably be a little bit controversial. Some of it you may not agree with. I'll just mention a few things at the outset that you may have questions about. The first is this idea of the best interest of the child. I would propose is a concept we should abandon, meaning the discretionary best interest of the child. We need more of an evidence-based and predictable approach, more of the best interest of the child from the perspective of what research tells us that children actually need. Secondly, I'll be talking a little bit about the idea of equal parenting as opposed to shared parenting. Now, equal parenting is a form of shared parenting, but it's a little bit more fixed. And I'm a strong proponent of the idea of equality in post-divorce living arrangements as opposed to the more vague notion of shared. I'll be also talking about the idea of responsibilities as taking precedence over a rights-based approach, purely rights-based. I think there is a place for children's rights, fathers' rights, women's rights, but the more we talk about rights, the less we seem to be concerned about our collective responsibilities to our children's needs. So I favor the idea of responsibilities over rights. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the idea of the so-called approximation standard as maybe one type of equal parenting where the post-divorce living arrangements are equal to what they were prior to divorce. It's a little bit controversial, but I hope you'll bear with me, and I trust you'll keep an open mind and allow me to address any questions that you might have at the end of the session. Just another point is my orientation as a family mediator is of course one where I really want to focus on common interests between warring factions in this debate around child custody. That is, for example, feminist concerns about parenting after divorce and fathers' concerns about parenting after divorce. Is there a way of, are there common interests there? So I want to identify those, and I also want to perhaps examine those that are not interests that are not held in common and see if both sets of interests and concerns, women's concerns about parenting and men and fathers' concerns, I believe they can be mutually accommodated within the proposal I'll share with you today. So I'd like to begin though with a few of the less controversial points in this field, around which I think there's general agreement in the field. Okay, this is not advancing. Thank you. Okay, we're good to go. Okay, so these are points I think where we have some general agreement in the field of divorce and separation. So I think it's agreed among most people that a child-focused approach is really important, that we base our decisions on really what is in the best interest of children. And it's also agreed that we need an evidence-based approach to divorce practice, both in the legal and mental health fields, as the best way to ensure that children's interests are addressed to the maximum degree. I think that's shared by both proponents and opponents of shared parenting. And I think for us to say truly that we have a child-focused approach, we really need to have an understanding of children's core needs in the divorce transition, and then a corresponding set of parental and social institutional responsibilities to those needs. I'll say a little bit more about that in a few moments. I think it's also, I'm assuming this, but I think most people would agree that, as Aristotle said, in fact, that the best laws are those that limit judicial discretion. And I'd suggest that nowhere is this more urgent than in regard to the best interest of the child. I'd also suggest that a new non-discretionary standard of the best interest of the child, from the perspective of the child, not only is it required, but it's achievable, which includes a serious consideration of what children themselves have identified as their main needs in divorce. Children are the ones most affected by divorce, and they're the real experts. By their own account, 3 essential elements stand out. And this has been identified by a number of researchers, probably most prominently by Bill Fabricius. 3 areas that are important to children. First is autonomy. To be given some kind of a voice to identify what are their best interests. Fabricius, his research examines the perspective of a large sample of young adult children of divorce, reflecting upon their experiences as children. So these were over 800 19, 20, 21-year-olds who had lived as children through their parents' divorce. Most of those children were in sole residential arrangements, but there were about 10% were in shared parenting, joint custody arrangements. So in that study, and of course in others that have examined more qualitative studies that have examined the issue, autonomy, to have a voice is important for children. Secondly, being shielded from conflict and violence between parents is very important for children. We know this from their own perspective and also from more general research. And thirdly, and probably most important to children, is that they have substantially equal time in their relationships with each of their parents. We know also from a wide range of divorce research, I'm thinking of people like Linda Nielsen. Actually, in 2013, Linda Nielsen wrote a couple of papers that summarized the current state of research, and so did Hildegard Sunderhoff in Germany, as did I myself. And we all concluded, based on a review of about 50 major articles over the past decade, that children's well-being is associated with these 3 factors: children having a voice, being shielded from conflict and violence, and having meaningful relationships, co-parental relationships with their parents. So from that research, we have clear evidence of a fundamentally different perspective of divorce and parenting after divorce than what many policymakers and lawmakers have assumed. We know that children want to be in the shared physical care of both their parents, and research studies support what children are saying are their preferences. We know that children in equal or shared parenting arrangements adjust significantly better than children in sole custody on all general measures and all divorce-specific measures. The two meta-analyses of research by Robert Balserman really make that clear, as do many other studies. Secondly, at the same time, research has demonstrated that reduction of parental conflict and increased cooperation between parents after divorce are critical to children's well-being, and that kind of reduction of conflict and increased cooperation is most likely to be achieved through shared parenting arrangements. So two key factors associated with children's best interests and fundamental to parenting after divorce law reform: the necessity of preserving children's primary relationships with both parents, and the fundamental need to address problems of family violence and ongoing high conflict between parents. Any new framework for legal determination of parenting after divorce should be examined carefully in regard to the degree that they address these two primary concerns. Now, the best interest of the child is a paramount consideration in any initiative to transform divorce law, policy, and practice in the arena of parenting after divorce. So that, I think, is a fundamental kind of tenet, but also, at the same time, any new approach must also attend to the needs and preferences of parents themselves, of mothers and fathers. Even though children's needs are distinct from those of their parents, they are very closely linked, and it's best to accommodate parents' interests and keep them happy. That is also in the best interest of children. So new legislation, I believe, must take on board the concern of parent groups like egalitatea parentală, the National Organization of Parents in the US, the Children's Rights Council in Canada, the Canadian Equal Parenting Coalition, etc. Mothers' concerns regarding family violence, recognizing primary caregiving, and problems with awarding joint legal custody without any corresponding responsibility for childcare must be accommodated, as well as fathers' concerns about their disenfranchisement from their children's lives, the importance of preserving emotional attachments between children and both parents, as well as parental alienation must also be addressed. So lawmakers have a huge challenge to accommodate all of these sets of interests, which some would say are competing interests. But I believe it's possible to address this full array of seemingly contrasting sets of interests. And finally, I'd say that divorce law reform needs to go beyond cosmetic changes, like changing the language of divorce, toward truly shared or equal parenting legislation that's not just shared parenting on paper, but in fact, in reality as well. We also need to ensure determinacy and consistency in decision-making and limit discretion in those areas in which judges have little training or expertise. The challenge is to develop and establish a legal presumption that enhances determinacy and reduces litigation, while at the same time serving the best interests of the child and taking into account each child and family's unique circumstances. So, I'm going to be talking about the best interests of the child from the perspective of the child and a responsibility to needs-based approach to parenting after divorce. That involves defining precisely what constitutes children's best interests. The approach to the legal determination of parenting after divorce that I'd like to discuss is a shared parenting framework, which is consonant with the European Council's recommendation that member states adopt shared parenting as the foundation of their family law. It's also consonant with research today, which has identified